Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the Technology and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As you join the Zoom and get settled in, I welcome you to share your name, role, and organization in the chat. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm the interim CEO of US Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. Today's session is a part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of this historic moment and create competitive winning bids for bipartisan infrastructure law funds that deliver real results for residents. Today's session is brought to you by Cornell Tech and US Digital Response and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropy, the Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. For those of you who joined us in December for our kickoff, I'm delighted to welcome you back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're glad you're here. This series, the Technology and Innovation Center series, aims to inspire local government leaders about the technology that will improve city infrastructure for years to come. We're really glad you're here. I want to take a moment before we get started to ground us in the 4 key values that guide this series, as shown on slide 2. First, we're driven by shared goals. We don't believe in doing technology for technology's sake. Second, we believe in designing for people, recognizing that the needs and desires of deeply diverse groups and individuals need to be taken into account. We're not all the same. Third, we believe strongly in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing the work, not just right now when there's a lot of funding out there, but we want to think long-term and think about how to sustainably resource this work when it comes to things like workforce, policies, and regulation, so that the impact to you and your communities isn't just in this moment, but rather it's a lasting impact. And last but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Technology and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, secure, reliable, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. So now that you're oriented to our series, let's dive into our topic today. As we shift to the next slide, thank you, Manny, where today we're not going to simply talk about what's needed for EV charging infrastructure, though we're going to touch on that. But where we're really going to dig in is thinking about how to ensure that the infrastructure is built out and maintained in a fair and equitable manner. We anticipate the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, for the U.S. Department of Transportation Community Charging Program to come out roughly at the end of this month. And ahead of that NOFO, we're really excited to welcome 3 incredible speakers to help educate us on this topic. Next slide, please. Joining us today are Catherine Stankin, Vice President of Policy with the Electrification Coalition. Catherine's going to start us off today by giving the big picture landscape on EV charging. Next, we'll hear from Aaron Kaiser, the Electric Vehicle Program Coordinator for the City of St. Paul, Minnesota. Aaron's going to be sharing the work and perspective from St. Paul to help us understand and learn how they've built out their EV infrastructure with equity top of mind, front center. And last but not least, we'll hear from Jordan Davis, Executive Director of Smart Columbus. Jordan's going to be sharing the EV charging infrastructure work of Smart Columbus, which is a region-wide smart city initiative co-led by the City of Columbus and the Columbus Partnership. Now, one last thing before we get started, we want to ask a couple quick questions of the audience. So you'll see the lovely Zoom poll window pop up for you. The first question is just inviting you to assess your understanding of what those equity challenges are when we think about EV charging infrastructure. The second poll question is seeking to understand how likely you and your jurisdiction are to apply for the U.S. Department of Transportation's Community Charging Program. Thanks for taking a moment to vote. Catherine, now I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Well, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm excited to be talking to you all in particular because it's one thing to have the federal funding, but now we need to move forward into the implementation and deployment stage. And so I have a lot of information to present, but I want to be respectful of the other presenters and stick to my time here. So there will definitely be slides to follow up this presentation with today, or just my remarks today, because I'm not going to use slides to just make it all the more engaging. And you can watch my hands. I'll talk with my hands a lot. So first of all, in terms of the federal funding, how are we thinking about, or how did Congress think about equity and fair paths to EV charging? And so with the legislation from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, you can think about it in these kind of buckets, or look for programs that have these topics within them. So it could be low income customers, it could be rural areas for deployment, it could be non-attainment areas, and it could be other maybe city specific policies, and also ports. Those are kind of the key themes, and you're looking through these different programs that were passed that are going to be addressing fair paths to EV charging. So in starting with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, one of the first things that everybody thinks about is the National EV Infrastructure Program, which is NEVI, which is the build out along the corridors. So we're all familiar with that. I'm sure many of you have been involved with your states so far in putting together that plan. But now, as just recently mentioned there, the $2.5 billion competitive grant program, and that's technically not under, it's not called NEVI, but it's just called this discretionary grant program or competitive grant program. And I hope they put some kind of catchy title around it so that we can refer to it that way. But we are expecting to see that program guidance anytime now. It's been a long time coming, and the Joint Office has been at work with that program specifically for a while now. We're also expecting to see the standards from the FHWA come out, and that's actually all Title 23 funding, but we're expecting to see those standards come out. That'll apply to NEVI installed infrastructure, but also probably the $2.5 billion competitive grant program there. But for those of you that are not familiar with that, because we haven't seen this guidance yet, just a quick recap of that program. It's $2.5 billion, but it's available to all alternative fuel infrastructure, not just EV charging. So it'll be a little more competitive. And the intent of that funding is mostly to continue the build out of the infrastructure along those corridors, but more so maybe in use in areas of high demand. And states will be definitely working close in hand with cities there. Cities can also just apply on their own, or metropolitan planning organizations and other local governments can apply for that funding there too. But 50% of that funding needs to be set aside for community grants. And that is giving priority to rural areas, low and middle income areas, multi-unit dwellings, things of that nature there. And there's a maximum grant of 15 million for that program. And some of that funding can also be spent on education and outreach. So this is definitely a big one. And yeah, we hope to see the guidance for that soon. But there are a couple other things under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that aren't getting talked about as much, but are very applicable to be enabling fair EV charging. And can more than one city apply together on the same application? I just saw, sorry, I know we'll get to questions later, but I do believe that you could, but the guidance will spell that out more specifically. But I know that they want the funding to be leveraged, very far and involve a lot of different private actors as well to make that funding go further. So I think that the more cities you can get on one application, the better. But let me just address a couple more policies from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So first of all, the CMAQ program. This is congestion mitigation, air quality improvement. So this is directly looking at some air quality and non-attainment areas. This is another great way to be making sure that infrastructure is installed equitably. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law made adjustments to this program about what is eligible. So for example, micromobility applications, bike sharing, okay, that's not electric, but it could be an electric bike, but also more of a focus on medium heavy duty EVs and those applications. So that's definitely something to look at now as the new rounds of funding come forward from states and how cities can apply, and to note those changes there. Other things, there's the Low-No program that received additional funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, but there's been some adjustments there. And then also a continuation of a program called Grants for Buses and Bus Facilities, in which case 15% of funding needs to be spent on rural applications. So just a thing to note there too. So there's so much funding available now, and it's going to be very confusing about which application is due when. And it's something that we're trying to keep track of, and which funding can you stack, which sources can you stack if you apply for CMAQ, and you're not awarded, can that then be used, or your application be modified for grants for buses and bus facilities? We think, yes, there's been a lot of communication across the joint agencies, or the agencies and the joint office now to enable that kind of speed of application in the process. Speaking of the joint office, though, just a note about how they've been responding to the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've seen the rural toolkit that they've put out. They're also working on an urban toolkit. This should be released also anytime now. And that'll be a great resource for cities because they'll have at the end of that an appendix that lists out all the various funding sources and hopefully also the stackability. So be on the lookout for that. Also note about the joint office is that they've been really, I think that they've been great about providing technical assistance. So if you are submitting an application and you need that help, or you're unsure or are not clear, it's their #1 job to get this funding out. So I recommend just, even right now, if you haven't reached out to them to introduce your city or your group, definitely do so because, that just starts your partnership and your communication off with them. So yeah, I think that the joint office has been doing a great job. So that was kind of the bipartisan infrastructure law in a nutshell. And we can dive deeper into some of those programs in the questions, but I'll move to the Inflation Reduction Act because this is a walloping program here. And there's been a lot of emphasis placed on the tax credits, but there's a lot of other places where equitable EV charging and access to the vehicles has been enabled. And so let's just, the top 4 tax credits, it's the 30D one, it's the 45W, 25E, and 30C. 30D is obviously for the consumer, the light duty credit that's been in the news a ton. You've heard about the sourcing provisions for minerals and batteries. We're waiting that guidance. Well, we saw some guidance at the end of the year, but we're waiting the final sourcing provisions to come in March. The 45W tax credit, though, that's one to highlight here in great detail for all of you because there's a specific provision that allows for tax exempt entities to take advantage of this credit. And it's essentially a 30% credit off of the incremental cost of a vehicle. And if you want to know what incremental cost means, there was recently some guidance that came out from Treasury that goes into that detail a little bit. And the IRS, they've been putting out a lot of good information there that describes that further. So that's a very good one to look at. That's also a new tax credit. The 25E tax credit, that's for used electric vehicles. That's also on the consumer side. So it won't go into that in too much detail here. The Section 30C tax credit. This is a tax credit that's been on the books for a long time now. It's actually for all alternative fuel infrastructure too, but a lot of changes made to this one. And we've seen some initial feedback to the IRA or IRS. They've already collected that, but the final guidance, we haven't yet kind of seen that based on some of the modifications to the program. So a couple things to note with the 30C tax credit is that this now has to be placed in an eligible area. So basically an area that's been defined as per the parameters in the statute, low income or non-urban. So essentially rural, or low income communities. We have encouraged the IRS to make this very simple for businesses, cities, entities to understand because nobody knows what a census tract is and they're not going to look that up themselves. And they just, if we could provide something per zip code, that'd be great. It'd be really easy to just type in your zip code. Great, I'm eligible. Okay. Also a thing to note for this one though, there is a tax exempt or direct pay option here too for tax exempt entities. So for cities, this is definitely a tax credit that you want to be looking at. And they've changed some of the parameters around project size, etc. Now, I'm going to flag just maybe 5 additional policies really quickly because there's so much more here. Like we could spend days talking about this, but the Clean Heavy Duty program, comments are due next week on this one. This is $1 billion replacing class 6 and 7 vehicles, specifically for areas that are in non-attainment. So if you're thinking about reducing air pollution in disadvantaged communities, they're often in these areas of non-attainment. And so that's a good program to look at. The Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program, $3 billion in this one. Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grant Program, there's about $3 billion in that one. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program, $27 billion in this one. So just looking at the size of the funding pots here, the bipartisan infrastructure law, essentially $7.5 billion for EV charging. The Inflation Reduction Act, that times 5 in terms of the overall funding pots. Now, just a caveat, all this funding and these programs for the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not all EV specific. So we are competing here with other types of alt fuel infrastructure and technologies. But given the goals of the Biden administration to reduce emissions, decarbonize the transportation sector, I think that EVs and EV charging technologies has strong chance of winning out on some of these competitive grant programs. Other things to note, we have a local government playbook that I think has been maybe shared with all of you, but if not, we'll send that as a follow-up resource too for what the next steps are that local communities can be doing and how to start taking advantage of this funding. Yeah, and I think I'll end there, but that's a lot to cover in just a few short remarks here, but look forward to the questions. And if it was confusing for you, it's confusing for me, and I work on this on a daily basis. So don't feel overwhelmed. We're all in it together. So I'll pass it back to the next speaker.
Catherine, that was amazing. Let me just say, as for those of you who have joined us for today, it was really tough to strike the right balance of how much detail, because this is such a complex topic. So Catherine, thank you so much you both gave us the high level, you drilled down into some detailed opportunities that jurisdictions can apply for, which was great. And folks, keep the questions coming in the chat, because we'll make sure we have time for a Q&A at the end. But now I want to invite Erin from St. Paul to share with us some of the work they've been doing on this topic.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina. So my name is Erin Kaiser. I work as the Electric Vehicle Program Coordinator in the City of St. Paul, and as part of that role, I oversee two technically different but heavily linked programs that I want to share that use some of the funding sources and ideas behind what Catherine was talking about. Next slide. The first program is the EV carshare program, which we launched in February of last year. When complete, the program will include 170 electric vehicles as part of what we call a semi-free floating public car share system. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But we have about 140 vehicles now. The program is available to anyone over the age of 18. And we call it semi-free float, or with a driver's license, over 18 and a driver's license. And we call it semi-free floating because the service area is across St. Paul and Minneapolis. And rides have to end within the service area. So they can start within the service area, they can travel outside of it, as long as they end back within our sort of outlined map. And I'll show that later as well. Users pay for the time that they use or miles driven, whichever is lower, and vehicles are charged at a specific EV charger found at charging hubs around the service area. And we'll have 70 charging locations when phase one is complete, and some of those are still coming online. And I know we're focused on vehicle charging right now, but I do think it's important to note car share programs such as this. We see several benefits, including reduced necessity to spend resources on personal vehicle ownership, as well as sort of access to multimodal transit. And then benefits sort of specific to electric car share programs is reduced air pollution compared to internal combustion engines, and then acceleration of EV adoption and capacity building. And I think we can go to the next slide. But sort of more specific about when we talk about charging, a second program that the City of St. Paul in partnership with the City of Minneapolis is our EV Spot network. And this is a charging network that supports both the EV car share program, but also public use for the chargers. And again, these chargers are placed at the same 70 locations as the EV car share, which is hard to sort of, I'm trying to make my voice sound different when I say EV, talking about the car share, and EV Spot network. And like this slide says, these 70 sites span the service area, and in the event that the car share specific charger is down or inaccessible, the car share vehicles can use the public chargers as well. The network will include 10 DC fast chargers, which many of you know they charge at a higher power, which leads to shorter required charging times. And all of our chargers are supported by 100% renewable energy through Excel's Wind Source program. And our utility has been a really incredible partner in helping us support both the EV car share program as well as this spot network. And how related to sort of just providing access, we think that, I mean, we believe, we know that this program, the EV Spot Network, is well positioned to support the increase in sort of electric vehicle purchases through the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, because it provides more charging opportunities to folks on a public basis. You can go to the next slide, Manny. And then here's a map of the service area. So you can see it spans Minneapolis and St. Paul for those of you who are familiar with the area. And then the sort of the blue dots are the charger locations. And like I said, carshare users can travel outside of this area, but as I mentioned, rides have to end within the outline. And it's not sort of evident based on this map, but it's worth noting that 50% of the charger locations are in ACP 50 neighborhoods, which are census tracts where at least half of the residents are people of color, and at least 40% of the residents live below 185% of the federal poverty line. And I think to boil that down into more sort of social points is that we wanted to focus on neighborhoods that have historically been left out of conversations and initiatives that are related to electric vehicle charging as well as car sharing programs. When we look at those neighborhoods, many residents don't own their place of residence, and in many cases that means they don't have access to installation of a personal use charger. And so the Spot Network supports folks who are maybe in multi-unit buildings or renters who want access to electric vehicles. And then next slide. And then I think sort of the bulk of what we really want to talk about when it comes to sort of fair and equitable access. This is a slide that sort of shows the site selection process. And obviously this is a huge oversimplification of how this process happened, but at a high level, sort of the first step was that neighborhoods were selected based on the objectives that you see here. So transit usage, demographics, housing and vehicle ownership density, any planned or existing bicycle facilities or mobility options, and then proximity to other identified sites. So, you know, the idea of building a network is that they support each other and they're not too far away or too close to each other. And then the second step is sites were selected sort of specifically within those neighborhoods to be placed in the public right-of-way based on very detailed and technical requirements. So you can see some of those listed here, right? There's space requirements, there's ADA requirements, you know, driveways, and any of those sorts of city planning ideas here. And then not listed on this slide is coordination with lots of divisions and agencies within the service area. So utility, traffic, sewer, water, forestry, as well as community-based organizations to make sure that these sites are being placed in the best locations that with the most access and sort of the least amount of disruption. And weaved through this entire process was deep community engagement, again, with 10 specifically named community-based organizations in under-resourced neighborhoods, which the program, I mean, there's a constant need and area for improvement as the project moves forward to continue to bring people in at every stage. There was lots of outreach and engagement when it came to sort of adoption of EV vehicles, and we're really looking forward to, as we expand the program, getting to talk to more folks about where specifically chargers should go within sort of identified block radiuses. And before I hand it off here, I think it's just important to note as we think about equitable access, it's access to chargers and car sharing doesn't end once the charger is online. It's really about sort of making sure that we're addressing issues and repairing chargers in focus neighborhood at the same or increased level of urgency as the chargers in neighborhoods of higher affluence. So it's not helpful to install a charger that you know, is down for months of the year and never gets addressed when you see other chargers in other neighborhoods getting fixed or addressed quicker. So like that's a lot of information, and I see there's some questions here that I just totally ignored while I was speaking, but I can address those during the question and answer. And yeah, I'm excited to talk more about this project with y'all.
Erin, thank you so much. That was a second example of a lot of great information condensed. And I think you've piqued a lot of folks' interest, as you can tell by the chat. So excited to come back and also dig into some of the community engagement that you signaled, because I think that can be certainly a really important element when we think about centering those whose voices have not been engaged in some of these types of processes. But at this point, I'd love to welcome Jordan from Smart Columbus to share about some of the work that you and the community are doing in Columbus, Ohio. Take it away, Jordan.
Great. Thanks, Tina. And really great to hear from Minneapolis as an example, and always good to hear from Electrification Coalition. They're such an expert in the national landscape. I'm here to share a little bit about our story. We have had a little bit of a head start because our community won the U.S. Smart Cities Challenge issued by the Department of Technology in 2016. And as part of that, Paul G. Allen's Family Foundation awarded an additional $10 million just focused on building out the EV ecosystem here in our region. I've been with the program since we wrote that grant and was specifically oversaw the electrification program. That program's now done and we've evolved, and I'll share a little bit about how we're renewing and evolving our work from there. But in 2016, we really started at a 0.3, roughly a 0.4% I should say, percent EV adoption rate in our region. And our goal was to increase that to roughly 1.8%, which is a very significant jump in the market in a 3-year period. We hadn't even started our journey. So I don't know how many of you are on the call in the same position, but we didn't have any proactive or encouraging policies on the book. We had no fluency inside of City Hall to encourage EV adoption. And so we were starting from a very, very basic, what does EV even mean? What is a PHEV? What is a BEV? Like, where do we begin? And so because we were starting at such that rudimentary level, I think it brought our community along quickly. And so I share that because I know a lot of people are chasing this really historic moment, but don't be intimidated by where you are in your journey. We did it and we started from nowhere. You can do it too if you're in the same position. And I'm happy to share with you how we did that internal education and kind of 101 sessions. We have a ton of 101 decks. I'd be happy to share with you as you bring along your partners inside of the city and in the community. But we really began our journey understanding where we needed charging to anticipate the growth. And that's really relatable to where we are in the market today. As you know, the automotive manufacturing companies are very bullish on going all electric. They're going to be incentivized to do that. They're encouraged to do that. And so EVs are coming to your communities, whether you encourage it or create the infrastructure or not, which creates a very big chicken and egg problem and a really big challenge for communities. And so we were in that position in 2016 to say, okay, we're going to go big on EVs. What does that mean? If we grow our ecosystem by 400%, where do we need chargers? So we knew that drivers don't just stay in one municipality. We are very gerrymandered. So you're crossing municipal lines to live, work, play in this community every day, multiple times a day. And so we knew we had to think regionally about our charging ecosystem. So we did a charging study with the National Renewable Energy Lab to look across our 7 counties on where we needed charging to meet that growth potential for the market. And I actually have the case study I will put in the chat. So if you are interested in learning more about that specific study, you should have all the information and more for you to look at. But I think my big takeaways from that I'll leave you with is it was helpful to zoom out, to look at it from a growth perspective, not just a where do we have funding to fund chargers, because from that we were able to then prioritize demand and need a little bit differently from the bigger viewpoint. So we started there. We then didn't have any money to install charging. So actually none of our grant dollars were going to go towards buying a charger. We didn't have any locally. We didn't have any policies to allow for a government to own that charging asset or for our utility to own that charging asset. So the next is we had to build partnerships to get this done. So really critical partnerships we had were site hosts, so landowners, real estate owners, particularly multi-unit dwelling developers, big partners, really, really important. Second was our utility. Our utility, we could not have done this without a very, very close relationship with the utility. We had NDAs with them to be able to understand where their capacity is, where we could actually site chargers. And we worked with them to essentially assign a team inside of the utility that would be our education and outreach arm with us to talk to site hosts, to get people to understand that it was feasible for them to have a charger at their facilities, et cetera, et cetera. We then actually ended up getting a rate filing with the utility that brought in money. So we were awarded funding about $9 million over 3 years to install 900 chargers around the region. So if you're lucky enough to get these federal dollars, the money's available. Now, how do you get it into sites and facilitate partnerships and the like? So we had a very big role in recruiting sites. So we had a goal of a minimum of 10% in low to moderate income communities. It was regional, so it wasn't just, in the urban areas. But then we knew that the government, or particularly the city of Columbus, could not own the charging. So in order to do public charging, we had to think pretty creatively about where could those sites be that they could be privately owned, and then how could we put out RFPs and other things to give right-of-way access. So the policy roles was really important to allowing for the investment to even occur. Just because we had the money didn't mean the sites just came, didn't mean the chargers just got installed. The ownership model is super, super important. So if you haven't thought about that, I'd recommend getting ahead of that before you go out for bid and grant. There are, if you're a lower adoption market right now, you won't be in 5 years. It's a loss leader investment. So it's important to know what you're getting into, if you are going to own the charging, or what you're going to offer up in that relationship. If you're going to partner with a private sector, what type of land lease are you going to give them for what amount of time to be able to operate that charger? And then what type of requirements are you going to ask them to make sure it's maintained for the long term? So we've learned a lot in that. I'll also share a case study on the utility partnership so that you have that. We're now in a new era. We've depleted all of that money. We've spent all that. We have over 1,000 new chargers in our market. It's a wonderful success story, but we need more. We filled the gaps that we had because we were really behind, but now the market's growing even more. And we have some equity gaps to close, and we have some more work to do. So we have embarked on a similar siting study. Hopefully I'll be able to share that with this group in the coming week. But it's even bigger. So we went to 15 counties. We were at 7. We stretched out to 15 because we believe that from competitiveness, we need to partner more rurally than we did in the first iteration. So we're trying to build even more alliances at the regional level for how we think about the charging ecosystem. And then we've really prioritized thinking about kind of long-term equitable infrastructure and where that needs to go. So we have different siting and logic for urban areas versus the rural areas, and I'll be able to share that as soon as our plan is done, but I think that's super important. And then we factored in where the state was thinking about putting the highway chargers in relationship to where we need local charging. And that's a huge consideration for us in this next round, because we know the state's going to do their job. We feel very comfortable about that. But we know that's not going to be enough for our local consumers and drivers here. So we need to think, where are those gaps? How do we get those resources? The federal money isn't actually going to close the gap that we need. So we'll be forming similar partnerships again, hopefully successfully with the utility for another rate continuation and the like. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of the dynamics of this ecosystem and what we've had to do. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Jordan, thank you so much. I think I just want to highlight, we just heard about how just at the federal level, but then also at the city and then the regional level, how different communities are approaching this moment in their journeys, the use of really creative partnerships, and how to center all of that on fair and equitable outcomes. So I'm so excited now as we transition to our Q&A portion. Again, keep bringing your questions to the chat. We're going to take this moment to do a redo on our second poll question, which again is, how likely are you and your jurisdiction to apply for the U.S. Department of Transportation's community charging program? As you take a moment to answer that poll question, I'm going to tee up a question, the first question for Catherine, if that's all right. And Catherine, there was a question in the chat earlier around like, how should cities start to prepare as we await the guidance coming from DOT later this month? You know, if as folks leave today's session fired up and inspired by the three of you, what are some tangible actions that they can be taking in their communities?
That I have to remove the poll question out of the center there. Yeah, that's a great question. There's so much that needs to be done, but I think first and foremost, doing it in kind of the piecemeal steps here. So in the local government playbook, I mean, we outlined some things to do today, some things to do tomorrow, and then kind of longer term. But starting to establish some of the relationships with whether it's states and the people that are working through some of the policies at the state level, like the people doing the NEVI program that might be different than those that apply for the $2.5 billion competitive grant program. Starting to reach out to your utility and involving them, whether you have a big investor-owned utility or more of a rural co-op situation going on, they need to be involved as well. And having them a part of your application or looped into this, I think that you know, the more actors that you can show bought into this, that helps to give your application kind of a leg up. Also a note about working with your states, because there are some of the policies, it is formula funding that comes to them and it'll be distributed out via the state. Others you can apply directly to the federal government for, but it might be a different person than you're used to working with. So for example, with the NEVI funding, that's a DOT office. With the Volkswagen settlement funding from years prior, that was an air office or an energy office. And so we're starting to see even at the state level, sometimes that office or that relationship between the DOT, the energy office, the utility office, like, or the utilities commission, that might be now a central coordinated role with your state. So I'd recommend doing a lot of outreach there and letting them know what your plans are and seeing if there's that opportunity for engagement. Also, I just want to say, you know, it's okay to feel overwhelmed again, because this is all, it's so much information and there's a lot of different pieces to think through. But in the playbook, we do also note that if you start to look at the policies you do have on the books and then ones that might also be needed, some complementary policies, for example, with the permitting and the siting of some of the charging stations, depending on who has that jurisdiction to approve where the permit goes or the siting for it goes, you might need some streamlining there. You might need to, you know, host a workshop for different electricians on how to work through that process. I mean, there's a lot of different pieces here to start to think through. So just, I'll say one step at a time.
One step at a time seems like a really great, that's really good advice. And Catherine, something you mentioned earlier was DOT's sort of, you know, interest or support of partnerships. So Aaron and Jordan, I want to come to both of you. And Aaron, I'm going to start with you. This is a question from Brian that he dropped into the chat. Can you talk about any public-private partnerships that have been a part of your work in St. Paul in terms of utilizing parking lots as EV charging sites, for example?
Yeah, so all of the chargers that are in our 70 spot sort of spot network and EV chargers are in the public right of way, including one library parking lot, which is very cool and exciting. But I think so answering this sort of twofold. One, we did have a lot of public-private partnerships, right? We're working with a fleet operator, Our Car, who's really aware of the market in the Twin Cities with carshare. And then our electric utility has been so helpful, as well as the partnership between the city of St. Paul and the city of Minneapolis. So, I mean, when we talk about why the program saw success, I think the partnership sort of like lightning strike was really important. But additionally, I think there is the informal public-private partnership between like having a charger in the public right of way in front of someone's business, in front of someone's home, and being able to effectively communicate the positive benefits of having a charger like that in front of someone's commercial business where they do pay taxes and contribute it to, you know, the community. And so I think just being really open and transparent and willing to hear feedback from all levels of sort of engagement is really important. And then yeah, being really willing to be creative about how to make partnerships work. It's interesting to hear Jordan's experience with just sort of like the rules and regulations about who can purchase what, how you can, make things work with federal funding and those kinds of things. And I think, asking questions and developing deep partnerships is so important.
That's so powerful. And Jordan, I was going to come to you with Catherine's question, which you addressed in the chat. I do want to welcome you to come off mute and add any additional color to sort of the types of incentives and the types of creative ideas you employed in the Columbus area to incentivize developers.
Yeah, if you are in our position, we just take a pretty market-driven approach, and people were pretty skittish on, will there actually be demand for this infrastructure? Am I just going to put it here and I'm going to end up paying demand charges and nobody's actually using it and things like that? So we were able to work through a certain set of demand charge waivers with both the city utility and the, the grid regulated utility, AEP. So that was really, really two kind of powerful tools for making DC fast charging a more market-driven approach. But then the incentive was a game changer. So the fact that we were able to cover some of the upfront costs through the utility changed the conversation pretty quickly. People were willing to do it. We did form some partnerships that were pretty unique. We worked with the local yellow cab here, and they had started to introduce electric vehicles into their fleet. And we facilitated partnerships with the libraries in key opportunity neighborhoods or low-income neighborhoods. And we actually have a customer for those charging stations because the taxi cab is using those chargers. The drivers are able to access the vehicles. They actually stay there, so they're closer to home. It's a safe facility. It's a well-trusted facility by the community. And then it brings a conversation into the neighborhood that is a first step. We also did a very few amount, but we did do about a handful of ride and drives in neighborhood communities to help start that conversation. We don't have any public right of way, like we didn't remove any parking spots in opportunity neighborhoods for EV charging at this point. We used all off parking locations. So whether that was at the community foundation, the libraries, or other civic nonprofit partners or businesses in the area, that's how we kind of brought it into the neighborhood first. We also have added into this new mapping exercise, which I encourage others to do. We really focused on public charging, particularly fast charging and level 2s and workplace charging in the first round. That was kind of like the basics, like no brainers. These are no regret investments kind of thing. Like these are going to be used, they're in demand, let's go. Now that we have those gaps filled, what we really need is a full court press on filling the residential gap. And because you're going to charge at home, that's the primary use case, especially as battery range extends. And a lot of the housing stock in the city of Columbus doesn't have attached garages or, attached garages predominantly, because if you don't, then it's very expensive to upgrade your power. And so we are trying to figure out a lot of that off-street parking isn't permitted. So you don't need a permit. It's kind of a neighborhood environment. So how do you bring charging into those areas? I think that's going to be a big question around equity and access for our community. I don't know how relatable that is to others, but that's been one of the challenges we've struggled with a lot. So is it equitable for a resident to have to charge at the neighborhood rec center overnight and walk to their home and then walk to the car in the morning? How close can we get it to someone's home? Or are there other ways to upgrade utilities to be able to allow for that? So that's kind of a new challenge we're faced with.
And that's such a great point about like, what does it mean to be equitable, right? And how do we define that? And then how do we come back to that as a constant touchstone to ensure we're heading in the right direction? Thank you, Jordan. I want to invite some of our attendees who I've seen drop questions in the chat. If you're able to come off mute and pose your question, one question, please, each to our speakers. And Patrick Crowley, can I invite you to come off mute? I saw a question you had.
Good afternoon. It's almost afternoon out here in California anyway. And so I work for the city of Modesto, and we have a county-wide organization called StanCog for Stanislaus County Committee of Governments. And so we've have a county-wide report. All of the opportunities that we have looked at for the municipality have been focused on public. And we're like the NEVI program that you were talking about, there are criteria that we cannot meet. So we are not eligible for some of the NEVI programs. But one of our biggest concerns is, since we are looking at public, not fleet services for the city and those kind of things, is that what is the maintenance and operations that other agencies have been involved in, as either uptime of the equipment, vandalism. You know, it's copper on the cord sets, and copper is valuable to some constituents. And so that's one of our major concerns of where we put them. Almost everything in our city is low income, disadvantaged. Our county is a non-attainment for air quality. So we meet all of those requirements, but it's more of capital so that we can get off the ground. Our local utility, in where we have looked, has ample capacity. Not for, in our sites, we don't have level 2 capacity, but we do have level 3 capacity. And so it's, you know, that capital infrastructure cost. So we have been looking at private partnerships, and either that or like an ESCO style agreement where we provide the parking space, and then we get a stipend off of the top or a mag on the actual rates. We're also looking at our paid lots, possibly having a partnership where if you bring in an electric vehicle, then, you know, that rate for the parking structure, the location for your parking, is reduced if you're in the charging station. So but basically is your impacts to your O&M and those kind of costs for your equipment uptime.
Great question. I'll invite any of our speakers to share sort of what they've seen in their communities or generally across the landscape.
Well, maybe I'll jump in quickly, and I'd say, so first of all, with the 30C tax credit, I'd look at that one too if you're looking to install more infrastructure and you know that the NEVI stations, like that, those standards there aren't applicable, as what you're saying, it sounded like. So that's one to look at. And then with some of these other programs, we have been, well, actually, even with NEVI, we've been advocating, hey, states really need to be including operations and maintenance. They need to set aside a specific budget for that. So I'll be curious now as we move forward with the second round of NEVI funding for California and for all other states, how that's included as a principle and parameter, and how the DOT approves some applications or the second round of NEVI funds based on O&M being called and singled out, and how they're addressing that. Especially then even more so as we get into years 3 through 5, because the first year and the second year is like, get the stations out there, get deployment going, get the money, the steel in the ground, that kind of thing. And then for some of these other programs, I mean, O&M isn't specifically called out, but I imagine it'll be part of the application process, how you're going to deal with that. So that's a very good thing to call out, though. I think you're right on track to be noting that now early on in the process.
Okay.
Yeah. Aaron, Jordan, anything either of you would like to add?
I would just comment, and I know there's another question here I was writing to respond, but our market-driven approach makes it very hard to control operations and maintenance expectations, as well as someone also asked about the rates and policies. So different site hosts have very different points of view on this. Some limit by time, so you can only be here for 2 or 4 hours before you have to move. Some offer it completely for free as a community amenity. Others charge without time limit. So that does make it pretty difficult to manage. It's probably the con of the market-driven approach, right? So, Austin, their utility has a really great kind of payment program and approach with their public charging through their utility. It's something we studied and just envied, but that just wasn't in our toolkit to use that vehicle. So we published some recommended policies, and because we were involved in helping to recruit a lot of sites, we helped educate them on what the role of charging is and why it's so important to have charging available to actually grow the market and vice versa. And so there's a big education role in there, especially as you're thinking about your grants. Don't discount, like just putting a charger in and expecting they will come. It's not the right way to think about it. Make sure you think about that coordination role and the education role that needs to go into play for both the site host and the consumer.
It's really helpful. I want to go to another attendee who has a question. So Ian Neville, I'd love to welcome you to come off mute and pose your question to our expert speakers.
Great, thanks, Tina. My question, so Ian Neville, City of Vancouver. My question was, I think, primarily for Aaron. In Vancouver, we have a fair bit of car sharing already, and we are trying to work with the companies here to convert them over to electric. And we have both kind of return to base, two-way car sharing, but we also have some free-floating companies. And my question was really, is there any strategy in place that you have to ensure that the free-floating vehicles end up at a charging station at some point? Or like, I guess, how does that work for the free-floating model?
Yeah, it's a great question. And our partnership with our fleet operator, Our Car, is sort of the best way to describe that. So they're 100% responsible for sort of redistribution of the vehicle. So they have a street team that manages like their app-based service and looks at where cars are clumping or not moving for a long time. And then, yeah, they redistribute them around the St. Paul or Minneapolis. And so, a carshare program isn't helpful if all of the cars end up in one specific neighborhood, because that's where people are using them. And so it has been a huge sort of issue. And then as well, in regards to incentivizing bringing the cars back to a charger, we offer a $4 charge credit or a drive credit if they end the trip at a charger. And the exact stats, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's like on average, like every third user is like bringing it back to a charging station. And I think it's worth noting for folks who are in cold climates that we also have a $10 drive credit for moving a car during a snow emergency. So that's a huge issue as well, making sure that our cars stay out of impound lots. And so we ask for user help to sort of make sure that the cars are parked legally. Because if you're not a car owner, you aren't thinking about sort of where your car is parked and how to make sure. And I think it's applicable in places where street sweeping is a regular sort of city service as well. And then I hate to go back to a question, but I do want to talk just a little bit about sort of our model of the O&M. So each of the cities are 100% responsible for the siting responsibility once the sites are up, and then the operations of those chargers. So St. Paul, we're in sort of a installation period right now with our charger OEM, but St. Paul will eventually manage all of the maintenance and upkeep of the chargers. And so we think that's a good way to sort of keep things really transparent and really equal across the system. Certainly requires capacity and training and sort of those kinds of pieces, but that's sort of the route that we went with our O&M.
Thanks, Aaron, for answering two questions in one go. And Ian, thanks for your question. I want to invite one final participant to come off mute and ask their question, and it's from Brian Schmitz. Brian, take it away.
Hello, everybody from Austin. I work with a consulting group. We represent a number of clients and all over the country, but mainly in Houston, Texas. We are in the beginning phases of trying to assess need in certain areas, as well as get a foothold on how to approach the grants as they roll out. So one of the challenges that we're looking at right now is in a number of the areas where we find complete communities or Justice 40 initiative type communities. We have large transit ridership, which is no surprise given the trends there. But we're looking, currently I'm looking at specific partnerships with public transportation in attaining charging sites at transit hubs. And I wonder if anybody had any experience or really any thoughts on maybe some best practices there.
Yeah. Erin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so oh, everything disappeared. Okay, you're back. So I think having a strong partnership with your transit authority is really important. So Metro Transit has been really great to us to work with. We're working on an expansion of both our car share program as well as some of our public charging with a BRT line. So we'll offer, it'll be two-way car sharing as well as charging opportunities along a specific line out into one of the eastern suburbs. But it's definitely complicated as we think about like agency interaction with funding and timing. I mean, I know, for instance, like we're building a big transit center in St. Paul, and you know, we're working on like securing funding to build out the network, and they're like breaking ground, right? And so it's hard to line up those timelines in that way. But I think a good place to start is having conversations as you think about street development and or transit hub development to make sure that electric service is in place, so that when you do get funding or get the go ahead on getting stuff there, you're not having to recreate some of the electric service upgrades that you've done, and installing transformers to make sure that the service is supported itself. So sometimes that's like the less glamorous, but still really important to have that underground support in there as transit hubs are being redeveloped or sort of built.
If I could piggyback off that comment and just raise one more thing, finding infrastructure costs. I mean, it's going to be difficult for any agency because they're going to vary so greatly across the board. But is there any guidance that you know of that will, in the public domain that will help our clients make better decisions about how many, what type of, and some of the outside capital costs sort of issues we may run into? I understand certainly, in terms of dealing with the electric companies and things like that about capacity at certain stations and things like that, especially when it gets into the phase 3 larger chargers. But has there been any guidance that you've seen or produced maybe that would be available?
Thanks, Brian, for that extra question. I'm going to invite our speakers to consider answering that as a part of this final question that I have for you. We're about to wrap up. So rapid fire from our speakers. You can respond to Brian's question or share one single piece of advice, an actionable piece of advice you have for the cities on today's call. What is something that, as we leave this really engaging discussion, what's that one piece of advice you want to share? Catherine, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go to Erin and Jordan.
Well, Brian, I put some things in the chat there, and is about just the transit hub charging. And if there's one resource there that I could point you to, I don't know off the top of my head, because that's involving a lot of different aspects, utility, the upgrades, the bus transition. But that program I linked in the chat, that does require you do a fleet plan. And so just thinking through the planning process that might, and putting forward the fleet plan, maybe that'll even unlock some more resources and ideas. But my one thing to take away here is to look at that 45W tax credit once we get final guidance and all that, but it's active now. And for cities, there's that direct pay element. So you can all take advantage of that. We think that that's going to be a great one for getting more light duty vehicles, but also medium heavy duty ones on the books. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Catherine. I know we're at the top of the hour, but Erin and Jordan, your 30-second responses, single piece of advice you have for cities on the call.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the folks here, I've touched on it, but I think having conversations and being really willing to have conversations both up and down as we think about community development. Having chargers in places where people are going to use them is great, but you have to make sure that folks feel included in the planning process and like they're active members of the electric vehicle community and charging community. So I think yeah, having conversations and building community around solutions is really important.
Thanks, Erin.
I think just to close out, you can't do it on your own. It's just, this space is impossible. So partnerships, think beyond what city-owned assets, recruit non-traditional kind of ways to achieve your goals, and get that regional view in place, because I think you'll be really competitive in this next round of funding with those collaborations across your region.
I love it. That's such a constant thread through what each of you shared. Folks, we're at overtime. Thank you to our incredible speakers. Talk about just bringing a ton of valuable insight, perspective, and expertise to share with all of the jurisdictions on the line. Thanks to all of our attendees. Thanks for being here and for posing the questions you have. We'll be following up via email with additional resources on this topic, so stay tuned. And also remember that the Local Infrastructure Hub website is a great resource to see upcoming events, to access a recording of today's session, and to learn about other resources that the Hub provides. Our next Technology and Innovation Center series session will be on Wednesday, February 8th at the same time. We're finalizing the content so that it can be relevant to the work that each of you are leading in your jurisdictions. So stay tuned. And until that next time, take good care. Thanks, everyone.